In your basic book that you have got as SBR, you have got a lot of words are being used about the types of banks. I would like to very simply explain to you the different forms of banks that we have got. Details, of course, will be coming and then giving you further on it. Like, for example, RBI, I think, is one bank which is at the apex of all banking system of the country, Reserve Bank of India, and that is Bankers Bank. The banks bank at RBI, that is what we have got, bank of the last resort, or whatever word that you want to give. The top apex bank of the country is RBI. Then we have got PSBs, public sector banks. Public sector banks are those banks where the government is actually holding on behalf of the public, and then these are like they may be totally owned by the government or partially owned by the government, but then they are the government's bank, so to say, like SBI, you have got it, PNB that you have got. All these banks, they are referred as PSB, are the big banks of the country. They are counted under that. Private sector banks are those banks which are owned by the private companies or the private persons that you have got, that's the private banks, and then they are big stakeholders in the economy at the moment. Like for Axis Bank, for example, that is a sort of private bank. For all practical purposes, they are doing all the banking services which a PSB is doing, and that is what we have got. These banks can be counted under that private sector bank. Then can be also foreign banks. Foreign banks are those banks which are governed by the provisions and the norms that we have in the banking sector for India, but nevertheless they have got their headquarters is based outside, and they have got their ownership is lying out of the country, and then they can be like Standard Chartered Bank and HSBC can be referred as foreign banks. Don't forget, while they have got their bases lying outside, the ownership lying outside, irrespective, they are guided by the same banking laws and provisions which is governing the banks of the country. They are tried to be given as a possible fair ground as is available to the other banks of the country, and that is where they would be called as foreign banks. The cooperative banks. Cooperative banks, as the name itself conveys, they would be basically run by the cooperative societies, and then they can be mostly, depending on the nature of the society, they would be having their banking services woven around them. Mostly they get classified into two heads: urban, which are mostly doing non-agricultural banking activities, and then rural, which is where we have got they would be doing with agricultural activities primarily, and that is where the two set of cooperative banks, and then the cooperative societies are running them. Then we have RRBs, regional rural banks. When we set up with a basic objective that they are locally organized, regional, and they are focused on rural activities, so that all those activities which are at the local level required, those activities which are they're suited to the local requirement, but then there are a lot of local attendance they did, but at the same time they were also exposed to the local issues, and then they were all getting sick. So what ultimately we ended up doing is that for the RRBs, they got into some sort of sponsorship provision, in which there will be some PSB who will be a sponsored bank for some RRBs. There were like close to 14,000, 15,000 such RRBs we had in the country, branches, so to say, probably close to 200 RRBs we had at one point in time. But then what I'm trying to say is that now certain RRBs come under the sort of control of certain PSB, and then they are called as sponsored bank, and that is how they are still functioning, and they to a great extent are able to meet the local requirement, and they are focused to the local issues, and then they happen to be doing a good job. Of course, there are a lot of problems also. Some of the RRBs keep recording. Then we have got payment banks. Payment Bank has been around in our country for about 10 years. 2014 they came into being, and then they are doing some limited services of the banking sector. They're not doing all the banking services. They're taking deposits, they're giving some remittances, but then they are, if you talk about all the possible banking activities, they are not doing all of them. But then they are doing some services, which is basically the taking deposit and extending the deposit, mostly the saving bank activities that they have got, which is where the payment banks are confined to. Then we have SFB, as we call them, small financial bank that we have got. SFBs are those banks. They are basically focused on, shall we say, micro enterprises. Those exclusive functions that they have got, the target groups, especially those people who are, I would say, less covered in other banking sector. They are basically trying to cover them. Micro enterprises, as the name itself, small financial banks are concerned, SFBs are concerned, they'll be doing those functions of banking for the small and micro enterprises. Then you have development bank. Development banks are those banks which are basically, as the name suggests, are covering those long purpose, long process, long drawn time based developmental activities, and they would be like related to the banking activities which are catering to the developmental objectives of long term. And then there can be some specific areas like NABARD we have got as one example, IFCI that we have got IDBI, they have Exim Bank we have got. I mean, Exim, like for export import banking, they are very much targeted towards promoting the development in the export and import sector, and that is how these banks are organized. I hope the various types of banks that you keep hearing in the newspapers, you are a little clear about them.